The time has come to tell the truth.
I'll wake up and smell the coffee.
Today is the beginning of a new chapter.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode, I'm delighted to once again be joined by Chris Clarke, author of The Dark Knight and the Puppet Master. He writes Parables, a fantastic Substack, and has recently released a new piece entitled The Two Deprivations about the recent by-election in Gorton and Denton. Welcome back to the podcast, Chris.
Thanks a lot for having me again, Will. Nice to be here.
It's wonderful to have you on again. Now, the first question I'd like to ask is, what was it about this particular by-election that kind of piqued your interest and made you want to write about it in the way you have?
Well, it was obviously a very interesting by-election in general, and one which was kind of bringing into focus a lot of the Labour government's challenges at the moment. I'd actually, long before the by-election was even called, been thinking about this question of which areas were really the kind of poorer parts of Britain. Who really was back of the queue, and because obviously the kind of politics of place and the politics of grievance often play out in the kind of populist age in quite interesting ways. Whether it's Nigel Farage attacking sort of attacking London elites or whatever it may be. A lot of the politics that we're seeing at the moment, I think, there's a kind of there's always another part of the country that's seen as kind of caricatured in some way. So I was interested in exploring it, and then the Gorton and Denton by-election, it kind of just knitted it together in quite an interesting way, because you had this simultaneous surge of the Greens and Reform, which you don't necessarily always see. They tend to do quite well in quite different sort of areas. And in some ways, historically, it was quite easy for, Labour can sometimes pass off areas where Reform does well as kind of, this is just bits of Essex that are kind of never, or Lincolnshire or parts of the country that are never really Labour heartlands, and likewise kind of pass off areas of Green success as kind of, these are kind of well-to-do bohemian areas that they're not the real. But you couldn't say that about Gorton and Denton at all. It's a place that is absolutely rock solidly traditionally Labour and at the very sharp end of things. So I was kind of used that as a starting point to try and explore this particular question of what I call the two deprivations in the piece. I was also quite taken and interested with, there was an analysis by Rob Ford, the political scientist Rob Ford, where he described it as this kind of Frankenstein seat. He described it as with kind of these two nodules of completely different types of challenges. So that kind of was one of the things that got me thinking about the area, the idea of Gorton and Denton as an area which had kind of quite different characteristics embodied within a single place.
And those two deprivations that you talk about, they're quite different, aren't they, in terms of the sort of like type of deprivation that we're talking about, kind of like worklessness, as you term it in the piece, and kind of like more in-work poverty. What is the kind of like core difference between the two, apart from outlined in the fact that one is involved in work and the other isn't? Yeah. And how do they link more to maybe one particular party and the other links to the other party?
Yeah, so the piece looks at the indices of multiple deprivation. It's sort of quite a data-heavy piece. And it compares how different seats, the polling in different seats, according to More in Common's MRP polling, versus where these seats rank for the indices of multiple deprivation, which looks at overall deprivation, but then looks at specific types of deprivation, in particular income deprivation, employment deprivation, education deprivation, housing and living environment deprivation. So different types of challenges that different areas face. What I was kind of what I looked at in the piece was what the interesting phenomenon whereby it's areas with certain types of socioeconomic challenges or forms of deprivation were much more likely to lean one way politically, and areas with other types of deprivation were much more likely to lean another way. So the kind of core essence of it, what I've called the two deprivations, is that places with educational deprivation and health deprivation, so things like high numbers of people signed off work with disabilities, employment deprivation, places with those types of challenges, unemployment, fewer job opportunities, fewer educational opportunities, tended to have to be leaning way more heavily to reform. And places with housing deprivation, living environment deprivation, income deprivation, which is kind of things like in-work benefits, were leaning much more heavily towards the Green Party. So both were deprived, both had real socioeconomic challenges, contrary to people who say, "Oh, this is the Greens only do well in kind of bohemian enclaves." That wasn't the case, but that it was different types of challenges. Now, what lay beneath this was actually that the places where the Greens tended to be doing well were quite often places which were, in a certain respect, they're victims of their own success. So they had very, very expensive job markets. They were very expensive places to live. And there was large numbers of poorer people working in service economies or things like this, really struggling to get by even if they had work. So the kind of classic examples was a lot of inner London boroughs, which a lot of people have recently been talking about going to going green at these elections soon, which had a lot of those issues. But when it came to education and employment deprivation and things like this, they didn't really have those problems at all because they are kind of areas which have got very strong economic centres of gravity. So the ultimate argument of the piece is, in many ways, the political challenges that we're seeing at the moment, in which Labour in particular is struggling to grapple with, are problems rooted in regional inequality, where certain areas of Britain have become almost sort of, I call it behind the glass deprivation, where they're kind of got very high inequality, really broken housing markets, and other areas have got a completely different set of challenges relating to um, kind of really a lack of economic growth and dynamism in those areas, which kind of creates the completely different types of challenge and seems to translate much more into votes for the populist right rather than the radical left.
Mhm. And I think it's interesting. You've sort of touched upon it a couple of times already. This kind of perhaps maybe stereotype that's associated with the Green Party of being kind of like maybe more of a sort of like
Mm.
a bohemian party as such. You know, the sort of like the stereotype of the sandals and socks kind of like image of
Yeah.
the environmentalists. Do you think that this is something that has sort of like changed about the Green Party, that it is able to attract voters who are, you know, suffering from income deprivation? And when do you think that this change may have happened, if indeed it has been a change, or is it just something that's been underreported and too often we've kind of focused on the stereotype about Green voters and not looked maybe as much at the potential reality of who might be within the broader Green coalition?
Yeah. The two seats where the Greens have done very well, sorry, that they've actually kind of won in direct contest with Labour, Bristol Central and Brighton Pavilion, are in some ways kind of outlier seats because they're not particularly deprived areas. They do have their challenges, but they're kind of way off in a different. When you look at the kind of scatters I've done there, they're almost so far you can't, the weird dots at the far side that you can't really see. And in some ways, maybe those kind of areas which are very self-confidently left liberal places, which I think is a great thing. You know, I
Mm,
went to university in Brighton, so I don't knock it. But the fact that the Greens have kind of been so dominant in those type of areas has been a bit of a false, given a false impression to Labour that they're the party of a kind of particular, quite small subgroup of
mm,
types of kind of left-leaning or
mm,
activist communities. Um, in terms of whether something's happened with the Green Party, I wouldn't necessarily say that a massive thing has happened with the Green Party as such. Um, so much as I think these areas they were actually voting quite heavily for Jeremy Corbyn
mm,
during the kind of Corbyn years. They so I think probably the thing that's changed is rather than seeking a home within the Labour Party, they kind
Mhm.
of, in our very multi-party system, they've been looking for a home, and it was never going to be a reform type
Mhm.
home, so it's become the Greens, and so I think that's more what's happened than that there's been an absolutely fundamental change in the Green Party. I mean, there has been a bit of a fundamental change, but um, I wouldn't say it's so much a Polanski factor as
Mhm.
people in poorer areas of poorer, diverse,
Mhm.
unequal inner city areas seeking a form, looking for the best party to articulate their frustration with the
Mhm.
government on certain issues.
And do you think that this perhaps shows kind of some of the challenges that we face when thinking about the Labour Party and the kind of like the coalition that helped elect Labour in 2024? A lot of comparisons, both before the election and subsequently, have been made between 2024 and 1997 in terms of it being Labour returning to power, after decades in the wilderness, and that there have been similarities perhaps quite overtly made, I think it's fair to say, by the Starmer team to New Labour. Do you think this shows that maybe it's much more difficult for that kind of like model of politics to exist in the current environment now? Because as you said, we've had voters who were, maybe attracted to Labour under Jeremy Corbyn who have since splintered off to the Green Party, something that wasn't as much of a challenge for Tony Blair in 1997, 2000, or maybe a bit more in 2005, but at least in those first two general elections wasn't as much of a concern for him in terms of an electoral coalition.
I think there's a sort of multitude of factors that are different between 2024 and 1997. Um, the sort of trust
Mm,
landscape, the uh, massive decline in party loyalty
mm,
over that time. So I don't. It's true that New Labour probably did a better job of keeping those parts of the coalition in the tent, if you like. But I would also say it's just generally harder to hold together any
mm,
type of coalition right now than it probably was 30 years ago. Uh, I think that the other thing is that the kind of Green or formerly Lib Dem or Corbynite
mm,
part of the coalition, whatever you might want to call it, it's probably grown for a range of reasons. There's a larger numbers of graduates in the population. The population is more diverse, so um, the kind of that voice has become louder and stronger
mm,
and demographically larger. So I think that that's probably another difference that's made it difficult to hold the two together. But I do think this has probably always been quite a significant challenge for Labour is how it sort of rides both horses, if you like.
mm. Absolutely. Um, just turning back to something that you kind of like outline in the piece is the link between um, Brexit, deprivation, obviously support
Yeah.
for reform now. Do you think that it's still fairly accurate to say that, areas that kind of like have a particular type of deprivation voted for Brexit and are therefore more reform leaning? Or do you think that it's a slightly more complicated picture that we can't just take up the result from 2016, map it onto the electoral map and say, well, this particular area is obviously going to sort of like support Farage because of how it voted 10 years ago?
Uh, I don't think it's going to support Farage because of how it voted 10 years ago. It's not kind of like a residual loyalty of we
Hmm.
voted for Brexit and now we're kind of sort of pinned our flag to that mast for forevermore. But I do think that certain the types of areas where Reform did well, UKIP formerly did well, um, Brexit votes were high, an incredibly consistent pattern of places with many of the same characteristics, and that hasn't actually changed that much between the two. In the past 10 years, for example. So I'd say the core. This has been a core challenge really for at least 10, probably 15 years, is political how political parties operate in a in a context of geographical polarization, and the articulations it's taken has changed. There's been lots of changes in the form that the populist right takes, the form that the populist left takes, some of them existing within um, the mainstream Labour and Tory parties, some of them existing explicitly outside of that. But there's a kind of continual tussle between the two. And it keeps on taking different forms, but it's the same real issue. And it's an issue which, as I put towards the end, there's a kind of chart which shows the difference in house prices over in the different UK regions
Yeah.
over the past since I think it was 1995 or something that it starts at, that are really dramatic. So I think the problem of regional inequality is driving the problem of the political polarization, and there's political ways, party political ways to deal with it, but ultimately starting to really get serious about how you address regional inequality, I think is part, needs to be part of it as well, and talking about that more, but doing more on it as well.
Hmm. And do you think that this is something, I mean, not just in terms of regional inequality, but also that distinction between in-work deprivation and worklessness? Is this something that you think is beginning to be kind of like discussed as two sort of like really separate issues in a way that perhaps in the past it wasn't? There seemed to be, it seemed sometimes in the past, a kind of like a lumping together of the two, that, talking about unemployment as a sign of how the sort of like the economy was doing was perhaps maybe a bit too much of a binary, given how you would have people who were in work but were suffering from
Yeah.
kind of like from deprivation. Obviously, like 2017 or thereabouts, when Theresa May was talking about just about managings and trying to
Yeah.
get that into the Conservative Party, but it didn't quite work out for her. It didn't sort of like fully
Mm.
kind of like follow through. Do you think now we're beginning to see it finally following through a bit more into the kind of like debate as a distinct issue, as separate from unemployment?
Yeah, I don't know the extent to which it's massively increased in the debate. I suppose that, yeah, the kind of just about managing squeezed middle terminology has become more common. I think more recognition of issues like underemployment being
Hmm.
issues, or people who are working, particularly during the post cost of living crisis, working but are still relying on food banks. I think there's a general wider awareness of those kind of issues, and that the level of unemployment is not the kind of only way that you can look at the challenges in an area. I think that the point that I'm making in my piece maybe hasn't isn't that widespread in the debate, which is that the greater the regional inequality, the more you get certain areas. For example, one of the examples I gave was Poplar, which is a deprived, very poor area of East London, right next to Canary Wharf, which is, I think it's 40th out of 500
Hmm.
seats for income deprivation, i.e., in work deprivation, but 350th for or something, 310th maybe for employment deprivation. So that's quite a big difference. That implies that you really can get a job in that area of London. But it's such an expensive and difficult area to live that you're probably really going to struggle anyway. And that is a product of regional inequality in a way, because the expense and success in some ways, technical economic success of that area has created its own new phenomenon. So I think that that element of it isn't maybe discussed as much, but you're right that kind of the concept of in-work poverty in general is discussed a bit more. The actual finding in the piece that I mapped, that kind of income areas where income deprivation was higher than employment deprivation, like Poplar,
Hmm.
were extremely heavily concentrated, was something I almost stumbled upon when I was doing the data analysis, because I just thought, oh, this is interesting. I keep on seeing places where this number is a bit higher than this number. And then when you look at it, you can see suddenly when you start to look at the patterns, it's always the case that in-work poverty is higher in areas which are more economically successful, like the South east and areas which are particularly have challenges but are also a kind of successful economy, things like
Mhm.
gentrification. Um, In-work poverty is much more of a factor. I think the gap, and if you look back at past indices of multiple
Mhm.
deprivations, not to get too involved in the data, but over sort of 20 years or something, you see that disparity getting wider and wider as in-work poverty and worklessness, which at one point would have been relatively close together in
Mhm.
most areas,
Yeah.
have moved further and further apart. So you've got a lot of areas which have high income deprivation and low employment deprivation, or vice versa, um, because they're either very economically successful areas where
Mhm.
it's, impossibly expensive to live if you or areas which aren't successful and um, it's difficult to get jobs and opportunities in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what has kind of like been interesting about this by-election and the way that you've analysed it and the kind of like the different deprivations is it obviously can be framed as a massive question for the Labour Party. How do you deal with these two kinds of like deprivations and the people
Mm.
who are deprived in different ways and the way that they're going, the different sort of like directions that they're going, as you mentioned earlier, the idea of trying to ride two horses simultaneously. How do
Mm.
you think Labour going forward can try and guide those two sort of like groups of
Yeah.
people back together into a coalition, or at least can try and convince enough of them back to the fold to make, things easier for Labour?
I think part of the problem is articulating the sort of challenges, because really what all of this comes down to is that there's certain parts of the country where you can't you can get a decent house but you can't get a decent job, and other parts of the country where you can get a decent job but you can't get a decent house. um, and generally speaking, the places that can't get can get a house but not a job tend to be leaning reform, and the places that can get a job but not a house tend to be leaning green if they're going anywhere. And I'm obviously massively oversimplifying here. There's loads and loads of outliers, but at a really basic level, that situation of regional inequality is unsustainable for democracy, really, and certainly for a party like Labour. So I think the first thing is to probably recognise that problem and talk about that phenomenon differently, and see, and rather than getting on the bandwagon of one area of regional, sort of certain forms of regional populism, actually saying this isn't a good situation for anyone to be in. So I think that's the first thing. I then do think that um I mean the difficulty on immigration is a massive thing, and I think the more immigration is salient, the more the two deprivations will
Mhm.
struggle to exist uh under a single umbrella, if you like. And I don't want to get massively into immigration policies and a debate about that, because I think we're coming towards the end, and that's probably not time to open that can of worms. But I think trying to find, I think so. I do think moving towards an economic focus is really important, um, ra rather than an overt focus on immigration being the central thing, because that's a really divisive thing. When I remember reading a Hope Not Hate reports a few years ago, which looked at the most pro and anti-immigration places in the country, and it was very interesting. Basically, the kind of 10 most pro
Mhm.
immigration seats were all Labour, massive Labour majorities, and the 10 most anti-Labour seats were massive Labour majorities. So Labour is particularly struggles with this because its historic coalition has been kind of ex-industrial areas and diverse inner city
Yeah.
areas, and those are the two deprivations that are moving moving apart. Yeah, so that would be my thing, is to find ways of focusing a bit more on the economic angle.
Absolutely. And as you say, we're coming towards the end of the podcast. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me, Chris. But I do have one final question. What is kind of like the core message that you would hope anyone say? in the government, anyone in the cabinet who were to read your piece, what would you kind of like say is the core message for them? And what would you say is the core message for anyone in Reform and the Greens as well? Are they sort of like slightly different, or is there similar messages for each party?
Well, the core message for Labour would be to not make the mistake of buying into the stereotypes about any parts of the country. Um, the politics of stereotype, I think, is almost interchangeable with the politics of uh, populism. So there was a quote from a kind of unnamed government source, which I don't know how real this quote was, about throwing Bohemian Green voters in snooty areas under the bus or something like this. It was a quote that I saw, which I don't want to criticize it too hard because I don't know how real it was, but it's the kind, I think getting at any level sucked into the language of London metropolitan elite or the alternative narratives in the opposite direction is very dangerous. Labour probably needs to be the party that sees itself as bridging this gap and saying and I would extend that to things like the kind of Andy Burnham Manchesterism or some of these ideas which also really play on the regional populism in similar ways. So I think that is the most important message I'd have for Labour. For the other two parties, it probably will work to play the regional populist card up to a point in terms of inflating their own votes, but they are populist parties which will polarize by their very nature if they do that. So I guess that would be my advice to them if I was wanting them to do well. But I don't know if you call that advice, but that's yeah.
Well, I mean, I certainly think that it would be something that they should take on board. Certainly, if they if they don't want to kind of like erode their voter base, but equally, I think it's something that is important for Labour to take on board. So I think that you've provided well balanced advice for all parties concerned.
I think a serious point would be that Reform could aspire to represent a certain type of deprived area. Let's say, setting aside whether Reform's policies are actually going to do anything for that type of area, Reform could aspire to represent a certain type of poorer area, which is more kind of red wall or these sort of terms, leave leaning, these sorts of terms, but would never really be able to reach into the areas of the other type of deprivation, the deprivation I call behind the glass deprivation, and the same is true of the Greens in reverse, that they could I think they would really struggle to expand their appeal to certain types of areas. So I think Labour kind of remains probably the only party that you could see really successfully straddling, if it could get some of the things I've talked about into the right place, managing to unite those two types of part of the country.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again for taking the time to speak to me, Chris. If people want to, to read the piece or to find out more about you, where should they go to do both of those things?
Yeah, it's the piece is on my Substack, which is called Parables. The piece itself is called The Two Deprivations. So if you Google that, it should be available. And I also I've kind of done a little thread about it on Blue Sky. If you type in Warring Fictions on Blue Sky, you'll find it. But those are the two main places.
Perfect. Well, thank you once again for taking the time to speak to me, Chris.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbeam, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.